introduce David and he'll begin his presentation. Bear with me. Sounds not.
If you have trekked Kokoda, the campsite of Templeton's Crossing will be familiar to you. So why not discover the story of the man behind the name? Captain Sam Templeton was the first Australian officer to be captured by the Japanese in the Kokoda campaign. After being interrogated by his captors, he was executed on the battlefield. Prior to facing his enemy, Templeton had predicted his fate, telling one of his platoon commanders that if he went into action, he wouldn't come back. Having resigned himself to his destiny, Templeton misled his captors on the numerical strength of the Australian forces waiting in Kokoda and Port Moresby. Did this disinformation, given by an Australian militia officer, slow the initial push by the Japanese into the Owen Stanley Range, allowing the Australian Imperial Force to join the fight earlier? Did Templeton create doubt in the mind of the commander of the Japanese South Sea Force, influencing an operational change for the attack of Port Moresby? A quiet and often aloof character, originally from Belfast, Captain Sam Templeton is mentioned in just about every book written about Kokoda. Prior to fighting in New Guinea, Templeton is reputed to have helped quash the Irish Rebellion, served in submarines with the Royal Navy during the First World War, and to have fought with the International Brigade during the Spanish Civil War. Kokoda legend goes beyond the myth to discover the real contribution Captain Sam Templeton made to stopping the Japanese advance over the Owen Stanley Range in 1942. You can buy the book at all good bookstores and at the Kokoda Historical website, kokodahistorical.com.au/shop.
While I'm just transferring the video to the presentation, just a reminder, please ensure that your mobile phones are switched off or on silent. The toilets are at the back to your left down the corridor. And we'll be selling the book after the presentation. We have got card facilities if you would like to use your card or cash at a competitive price of $25. I'm just displaying what it is to do multitasking at the moment. So bear with me, it won't be long. The machine decided to turn itself off. So we just have to restart it and we'll get onto it straight away. Good one, you've got a young fella here. Right, take two. So after watching that video, hopefully that was just a bit of a taster, as David had said, to get your appetite. David Howell is a Melbourne-based writer, tour guide, historian, specialising in the Southwest Pacific area operations during the Second World War. And as you already have heard, is the author of the recent book, Kokoda legend, Captain Sam Templeton. With extensive experience as a guide at the Friends of Kokoda at the Kokoda Track Memorial Walkway in Concord and the Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne, educating visitors about the significance of the Kokoda campaign. David created and was the editor of the Shrine's history magazine, Remembrance, at the Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne, and also created and ran the Friends of the Shrine program. In 2015, he returned full-time to Kokoda Historical. David served for 15 years as an infantry officer, soldier in the Army Reserves. In 2008, he deployed on peacekeeping operations in the Solomon Islands. David is well published in Australian military history and a regular guest on many radio and television history programs, including the award-winning SBS series, Who Do You Think You Are? So we put our hands together and welcome David Howell.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? There we go. This one. All right. It's great to be back in Sydney. I do live down on the Mornington Peninsula in Victoria, but I was born and raised in the Blue Mountains, so it's wonderful to come back to Melbourne weather in Sydney. As you saw with the little teaser of my book, obviously Kokoda's been a passion of mine, but in particular, one person that I've had an obsession with for most of my involvement with the Kokoda story, and that is Sam Templeton. Why, you may ask? Well, when my first introduction to Kokoda was with my best mate who's sitting in the front row. There's a Sydney sider, Greg Small. He talked me into walking the Kokoda track in 2004. And when I came back, I was interested. I lived down on the south coast at Corrimal, and the president of the RSL was a Kokoda veteran. And through that, and meeting the Illawarra National Servicemen's Association guys, we got guiding, and I guided for a good many years at Concord. And when I was at Concord, I reconnected with my grandfather's generation. He died when I was 16, but I always used to joke and say, if you go home, I wouldn't know what to say to the girl's father, but I certainly would know what to say to the girl's grandfather. And that sparked my interest. And one of the cans, or one of the plaques down at Concord, I would walk past and take school kids around, was this guy, Templeton. And that's when I first heard his name, saw a picture of him. This is actually the picture that's on the front cover of the book. And of course, when you walk the Kokoda track, just over halfway, depending on which way you're going, there is a place called Templeton's Crossing. So all these things sparked my imagination. But as I developed my own learning about it, the things that I thought to be interesting is you have this guy who seems to be surrounded by mythology. Howell, no history book until recently even had got his age correct. They'd always put his age up. There was talk that he'd served in submarines in the First World War. There was talk that he'd served in the International Brigade in the Spanish Civil War. There was talk that he was a black and tan in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. There's a whole range of things. And I guess the journey, which is 10 years in the making, not so much the writing of it, but the journey, from New South Wales to Melbourne to Northern Ireland, and obviously Kokoda in between. I must say, and I'll show you a slide later on, that Reg, who is his son, Reg Templeton, is still alive. And last year there was a big push for me to get the book out because Reg is 97, I think. And I wanted to make sure it was out before he did. So here we are, full circle back here in Sydney. So I'll kick right on with some. I'm not going to give the complete story away because you wouldn't do that if you're trying to sell books, would you? But hopefully, like the video, I'll give you a sort of an overview and a look into the guy himself, and also where I think he plays an important part in Australian military history. And I must say that I've written a lot of things in my life, but it was a difficult task to be able to do a biography that also has a historical argument. And if you're a budding author or a young author, maybe some are better at it than I am, but it was a difficult task to do that, to have biographical stuff, but also to have your historical argument in it. This picture here is Thomas and Lizzie, and one of the Templeton's children. We're not sure, it could be Gertrude, it might be the firstborn that died in infancy, but they are from Belfast. They were Presbyterians. They had lived in one tenement housing. They'd also, his father Thomas had worked for Harland and Wolff, and among other ships, I guess famous ships. He was a carpenter and he decked out the Titanic. So interesting story before you get to Sam Templeton. And if you think when Sam Templeton was born, he was actually born on the 28th of January 1901, and you think, the Victorian age had just concluded. You had Belfast, one of the most emerging industrial cities in the British Empire, if not in the world, certainly with shipbuilding, and of course you had the religious divide. So it all conspired, I guess, to be at that time in our history in the 20th century where a lot of things were happening. Jumped too far there. But as I said earlier, one of the things about Templeton was all these stories about where he'd served, what he'd done. Nobody had actually bothered to pull his First World War service record. Certainly no one really published anything. And if anybody knows about trying to look at British service records in Kew in London, you'd probably know that a lot of the First World War records for British service personnel in the First World War was destroyed in the Second World War in the Blitz. But luckily, Sam Templeton's service record, I think they say 40% or something were destroyed in the Second World War. But luckily, I found Templeton's file and I pulled it. Guess what I found? The picture on the left there is his enlistment photograph, and he's a fresh-faced guy there. He's only just old enough really to go into war, and he only makes the tail end of the war. And he was in the Royal Naval Reserve. He wasn't on submarines, and he joined. It's a very easy date to remember because he joined on the 25th of April, 1918. Coincidence for you. I also found, and I got his service record for when he when he served in the Royal Irish Constabulary. So for those who don't know, obviously prior to the Republic of Ireland and the six counties in the north remaining to Great Britain, there was one police force, and in Phoenix Park in Dublin is where they did their recruits. And Templeton, having not long been out of the Navy and doing a few odd jobs, had joined as a police officer. Now, Ireland has the Easter Uprising in 16, and it's not related to the time that Templeton was in service with the police. But he joined just to be, I think, from what my reading was, to get a job. Yeah, it was a job. He'd done some service. He obviously liked being in uniform. He'd been in the Navy, obviously, just at the tail end of the war. It gets enough to get his 2 medals, but he doesn't do much. He doesn't see any action, and he joins the Royal Irish Constabulary at a time when Ireland's going to have a civil war in relation to partition. And you may or may not know this part of history, but Winston Churchill was one of the guys that orchestrated getting ex-servicemen that we would say had PTSD or shell shock in those days, and brought them over to. Really, they were thugs to keep down any ideas of rebellion, if you will. And they called them black and tans because they had a mix of police uniforms and army uniforms. But it's interesting in the legend that Templeton didn't serve at that time when they had 2 civil wars, the 1920s, and he wasn't in the black and tans. He was simply a police officer, and he joined because he wanted a job. And it was a job that he could do, obviously, but hadn't seen service before. But he wasn't in the black and tans, and he certainly didn't participate in too much sectarian violence, although he would have experienced things I read in accounts like not being served in shops because he was in uniform. I'm not going to go into the politics of Ireland, but at that time in history, the Templeton family were Presbyterians. So obviously you had Church of Ireland, the main Protestants, you had the Catholics, and in the middle, Presbyterians. Yes, they were Protestants, but they were still looked down upon. It's not black and white. There's all different shades of it. So, in consequence, he gets out of. In fact, in 1922, they disbanded the IRC altogether, and he's out of it by then. His brother also, we think, served. One of his younger brothers served with him, and of course, things were starting to heat up. In Northern Ireland. So he leaves. And he's thinking about going to Canada. He goes to England first, and then he gets on a ship and he immigrates, probably under the, in Australia we called it the soldier settlement. It was a scheme similar to that, where people who'd done service could come out to the New World, if you will, and Templeton certainly got on that bandwagon, I guess. And why? And in the family folklore, the reason that the two brothers, because his brother finally comes out a few years later to Melbourne, is because of this sectarian violence that's going to happen, or is happening at this stage. And we think that Templeton hid his service in the police, not to be branded as black and tan, because when he comes out to Australia, he lists farmhand. Now he's from Belfast, it was an industrial city. I don't think he'd ever been in a farm in his life. So he does come to Australia, and he enlists in the militia in 1931. Again, nobody had really pulled his file, and the National Archives, which is a great source, has not only his file for when he was in the CMF, but it also has his interwar years. And he came to Melbourne, he settled in Melbourne, and he served in what was then Victoria's biggest standing, I guess, infantry militia, which was a Victorian Scottish regiment. It had a lot of pride. You had to have a connection either through your father or a Scot or something along those lines. Later on in life, when I went to Melbourne, I ended up serving in what was left of the VSR, just one rifle company within the 5th, 6th Royal Victoria Regiment, but the kilt and everything, you can see what the attraction is, and that's Templeton there in the middle. And you can see that on his, I think that's at a tripping in the colour that was held at Royal Park in Melbourne, but you can see by that stage Templeton is a senior NCO, and he's also wearing his 2 service medals he got in the First World War. But this is an important point, because as I said about that mythology surrounding him, he couldn't have gone off to fight in the Spanish Civil War, because his militia record shows him from a private all the way up to one officer class 2, when he ended up being the B Company commander of the Victorian Scottish Regiment. So if you think about it, it's not like you could just pop on a plane and have a jolly over in Spain and come back again. So all of these things, it's not terrible. I mean, it's hard when you have an idol, someone you look up to, and we're going to get to why I looked up to him. But it's hard when you start to strip the layers back. But nonetheless, the service record doesn't lie. He served in the militia. He had a small break. He lived in Cheltenham, which is just heading down towards the peninsula out of Melbourne. And he worked for Corn's Pastry as a delivery driver. He worked in the railways. But when you start to look at his employment history, efficient, nothing wrong, but nothing overly great. And although I couldn't find where he went to do any secondary type of schooling, I would suggest that Templeton was probably, he'd get to a certain point in the job and his education didn't allow him to go any further. But nonetheless, he lived in Cheltenham. He married a lady named Doris in 1931 or 32, around the same time that he joined the militia. Unfortunately, his firstborn, a guy named Carl, had passed away through influenza, and he's buried just across from Audio train station if you ever go down the Peninsula line. It always seemed, it became apparent to me when I was doing the research, it always seemed that he just missed out. He missed out on the First World War. He got the tail end of it. He missed out on the troubles that were in, fighting in Northern Ireland. He was just a policeman in between. I shouldn't say just a policeman, but he wasn't in the thick of it. And then, of course, when the Second World War first was, I think his son, in the book I have a little story of the family folklore of the Bakelite radio, and, the Menzies speech on it, and knowing that Dad was going to be called up for full-time service. And I think from memory, and New South Welsh people may correct me on this, but when war was first declared, the first deployment of troops on land was the Victorian Scottish Regiment that went around from Queenscliff all the way down to Point McKean, and they were putting up roadblocks and they were digging beach defences, but obviously there was nobody coming in September of 1939. And if you know a little bit about it too, that obviously we had the compulsory service, almost like a conscription, where if you're 18 to 35, unmarried, not in a protected trade, etc., you had to be called up to do militia service. Templeton was already in the militia. He was trying to get a commission. He made it from a private to officer class 2, and he was desperate to get a commission. He was desperate in 1940 to get commissioned into the second AIF, obviously with the intention to go and fight over in the Middle East. And for those who don't know, when war was first declared and we started to raise, especially the 6th Division and later the 7th Division, they turned a lot of guys away. There was so many people that wanted to join, they had their choice. And units like the militia units, like the BSR, were never going to deploy as their own unit because we made expeditionary forces or we created other forces. So Templeton was desperate to get a commission, and the commission that was offered to him was to go into another militia unit, which was the 39th Battalion. And by this stage, we're talking 40 into 41, Australia had put together fairly quickly infantry militia brigade, the 30th Brigade, to be sent up to Port Moresby, which was then in the territory of Papua, which was sovereign territory, because it's very important that militia couldn't be outside Australian territory. And Templeton gets a commission. He trains down at Darley Camp, Bacchus Marsh in Melbourne. The 39th, I think, because if you look at their sister battalions, and we have Rob Denny, the president of the 55th, 53rd Battalion here, the 53rd Battalion certainly didn't have, if at all, any training. That's where you get the stories of Kokoda firing their rifles for the first time on the ship on the way over. The 49th Battalion in Queensland, not as bad as the 53rd, but the 39th, at least they had participated and they were getting similar training to the AIF in Victoria. The only difference is, of course, at that time, the doctrine wasn't geared up for jungle warfare, which, as history shows, this is where these guys were going to fight. So Templeton gets his commission, and it's very easy because he was B Company, Victorian Scottish Regiment, and he becomes B Company OC of the 39th Battalion. And they're part of this militia brigade, if you will, that is sent just before the balloon goes up, if you will. These units are created to go and, have some sort of force in our buffer zone to the north, and in this case, Port Moresby. I only recently, a veteran by the name of Alan Kangamore, I took his ashes up to Kokoda in 2022 with the then CEO of the modern 39 OSB, Dave Reddy, and Kanga lived around the corner from me down at Mount Liza. He knew my family, knew my kids, but he was a close connection to Templeton in those early years. He'd gone to Melbourne Grammar, he'd been in the school cadets, he got a commission very quickly, became a lieutenant, and was, for a time, Templeton's 2IC in Port Moresby. He didn't go over the track and fight at that time, he fought at the beachheads later, but I was very lucky to have, for a good, over a decade, to regularly visit someone I could call a friend, but also someone that knew Sam Templeton. So it was almost funny that coming from New South Wales to Victoria, all these things were leading in the one direction. So if we get into the guts of why it's important, so obviously, as I said, the 30th Brigade went up to Port Moresby for garrison duties. Japan obviously enters the war in early December, and B Company of the 39th Battalion, which they thought was the best trained, not necessarily B Company, but the 39th Battalion out of those three battalions within the brigade, they were tasked to walk across the Kokoda track and with a view of doing some reconnoitring, if you will, but also to get to the northern part near the beaches. I'll show you a map soon. To probably what would have happened had the Japanese not come so soon was to provide security for American soldiers or engineers, I should say, to build an airstrip. Because if you imagine the war in the Pacific is all about being able to project those assets out, and having an airstrip on the northern part of Papua was something that was important, but as we're about to see, that doesn't take place. This photo here was taken by a man called PJ McDonald, who McDonald's Corner is named after. Templeton, I think, must be just out of shot because the pointer, this fellow here, is a guy named Merrick Stevenson. He relieved Kangamore, that I spoke about before, as the 2IC of the company. And it's very important because the 39th Battalion got on promotion a lot of men from the 2nd 14th Battalion, so sergeants, for example, two of his platoon commanders, Templeton's platoon commanders, had fought in the Middle East and came on promotion to being platoon commanders to come. So the 39 in Port Moresby, they got rid of a lot of officers and senior NCOs who had been rated as not fit for tropical service, including their RSM. And Kanga, the cemetery in Frankston, just down the hill from me, he used to always joke that the RSM, the original RSM, is buried right next to the Louvre, and Kanga was always laughing about that. But the point of it is that they got all this new, senior NCOs and officers in there who had seen service, had seen combat, because for most of the guys in the militia, as I said, the average age, the history sometimes can, mythologically speaking, it's not correct to say they're all 18-year-olds. The average age of the 39th Battalion was around 20 to 21. That's what the statistics we're looking at there. Of their age groups are, but they were still young guys, and the difference is that they had not seen any combat, and most of them thought they were just going to do garrison duties in Australia, maybe go up to the Northern Territory, but as history would show, they not only got up to Papua, but they're there at a pivotal time when they're just about to go up against Imperial Japanese Army. So this photo we tried to recreate. So in 2017, that's obviously me at the front trying to be Sam Templeton, but I'm a bit taller and a bit fatter. But we got a whole group of people that had, we got replica uniforms, the webbing, the boots, everything. Actually the boots were, the guys gone now, but Simon Lawrence Ordnance down here in George Street. We got everything put together. In fact, amongst the guys that came on the trip with me, we had a guy, Andrew Miller, Dusty Miller, who is a Medal of Gallantry recipient for Rwanda, I think. And we had several guys that have been to Afghanistan, etc. in there. But we all did it because we weren't trying to go and recreate battle, but we were trying to recreate the journey. And when we go back to that slide with out front of McDonald's Corner there, and that's McDonald's Corner in 2017, where the 39th set off, the Japanese had not yet landed on Papua. They set off on the 7th of July, and the Japanese don't land until the 21st of July. So the idea that when we did this recreation, if you will, was not so much the battle, because the battle hadn't happened yet, but we did a recreation to see what it was like to walk a mile in their shoes, if you will. And for those of you who don't know, or you may not if you've been up there, it's quite a distance from McDonald's Corner to the start of the Kokoda track. It's actually hard because you're not under canopy, you're just out in the open along the road. But the Papua New Guinea Correctional Services use 303 rifles for their ceremonial, and so I was very lucky to get a permit to carry them around PNG and Borodov. And again, the idea was to follow in their footsteps. And there was a guy who was one of the B company who was attached to it, a guy named Jock Wilkinson, and he kept a diary. And he kept a day-to-day diary of their journey for just over a week and a half from McDonald's Corner all the way to Kokoda. But the interesting thing was, and we tried to follow it and stay in the exact same places, and not to use what we were carrying with us. And you can imagine, within the soldiers' kit in those days, sleeping bags were in quick drying Gore-Tex to keep the water out. We had a grey blanket and a ground sheet, and it was very interesting for people the guys that hadn't done any sort of army service before. You imagine what happens when a grey blanket gets wet. We also did the same rations, mechanically stew, bully beef, all that type of stuff. And again, what we were trying to recreate is to get a feel of what they would have gone through. And I must say, disappointingly to us, the best we tried, we failed to meet each of their campsites. It was too difficult for us. You can imagine boots that don't have grip on them, they've got a heel on them, slipping and sliding. And it was very interesting because when you read in the history books about Kokoda, you talk about people, soldiers, even passing their rifles off to the local carriers, taking their weight off. And of course, we didn't have ammunition, so we weren't as heavy as those guys. But it was very interesting, and it was something that I enjoyed doing, but I don't think I'm going to go back and do it in a hurry. So Sam Templeton, leading B Company, he's got with him a guy named Bert Keens. I'll show a slide of him later. He marched them across. They get to Kokoda. Again, it's more of an admin move. They're reconnoitering. They're going to go up to the north coast. I'll show you the map in a moment. But when they get to Kokoda, Templeton leads them there, and he takes a couple of men with him, but he goes off to the north coast where a schooner called the Gilly Gilly was bringing in the heavier stores. So things like the helmets. One soldier recalls that a kit bag came with his wool service dress, which is not really great in the tropics, but all those types of things. And a lot of people talk about us correction history books previously had spoken about Templeton going all the way to where the Gilly Gilly had come in. He didn't walk that far. He only got as far as a place called Awala, which I'll get to in a moment, because the distance, and I've done Kokoda 78 times, and if you could not walk, the distance between Kokoda and the northern beachheads is about the same, different terrain of course, but where the schooner came in is further out towards Oro Bay, and there's no way that you could walk it in 2 to 3 days. It's just impossible. No human could do it. It's just too far. It's nearly 200 kilometres. It's just not possible. So that was all very interesting. So Templeton goes up there. He goes to meet the heavy stores coming back. He runs into an ANGAL, Australian New Guinea Administration unit guy, coming back with his quartermaster, if you will, and they get to a place called Wala, which is interesting because that's where the first contact happens. And we've only just gone past the anniversary of that, which is also their Remembrance Day in PNG, 23 July. And it happens here in this campaign. So 21 July, the Japanese land, they've got tasks that they need to achieve, and that is because they want to build a beachhead, they want to make an aerodrome there, they also want to establish an area for stores before they start continuing their mission, which is to traverse Kokoda track, make it to Port Moresby and seize Port Moresby. I'm sure you're probably all aware, the Japanese Operation MO, Battle of Coral Sea, stopped the naval landings from Port Bay, Port Moresby, so their next attempt was to come down from Rabaul, land on the north coast of Papua, fight overland across the Kokoda track. But it wasn't to be as quick as what they wanted to, because we have a look here. Get the mic. Okay, if you have a look, well, that's better, isn't it? If you have a look here, you can see right up here, this is where at the end of the campaign you have the three battles, Buna, Goda and Sanananda. But just in between Goda and Sanananda here is a place called Basabua, where they first landed. It's some 80 kilometres just from Saputo down to Kokoda, so it's quite a long way. And where the stores came in is all the way around here. It's just too far, you just couldn't do this. And, you know, walking a mile in their shoes proved that. But so Templeton goes here as far as Awala, and he meets his stores, and he's on his way back. He's on his way back to Kokoda, and the story goes that he heard what he thought was possibly thunder, but actually what it was Japanese warships shelling the coast in preparation for their landing. Now the Japanese, when they first landed, wasn't coming to walk across Kokoda. As I said, they had other tasks to do. With the 39th in the forward positions, and we can't leave them out, was the Papuan Infantry Brigade. So Papuan soldiers commanded by Australian officers and NCOs, and they all converge around this area here near Awala. There was a big obstacle here being the Kamusi River, Wairopi, pidgin for wire rope. There was a bridge there, a wire rope bridge there, and this is the centre of all of these activities. In fact, when the Japanese first landed, as you saw with that other slide, Awala was the first contact. That's where that happens at 23 July. By the 26th of July, only 5 days after the Japanese landed, Templeton is captured and most likely dead by the 26th. Around this area here, there's all these little villages. This is on the other side, this is on the Kokoda side of the Kamusi River. You've got Ilamo, Gari, but important, Oibi. And this is important because Templeton, when he realises that the Japanese is right in the thick of it, he doesn't have much at his disposal. He has 3 rifle platoons. That's all he has. He leaves one back at Kokoda to defend the plateau, and he has 2 with him, and 1 main up at Oibi. And they start to form a perimeter because the first contacts had already happened at Awala. Some of the PIB withdrew back some of the PIB went off to the side because they didn't know where to go. Some of them swam the Kamusi River, got back to the other side. They cut the wire rope bridge, they destroyed stores. It was complete chaos. And they all converged down in this village here, which has some high ground there. There's a little plateau there at Oibi, and that's where it's all about to kick on. Templeton is hopeful that more troops are going to arrive by air, because obviously Kokoda is important because it has an airstrip. However, only half, the commanding officer, who was a new commanding officer, Bill Owen, he comes in, and another plane load comes in a day later with only 14 men, a guy named Doug McLean from D Company. After that, no more men get in by air. Every Australian soldier that comes to fight have to get across the Kokoda track. And when you read history, obviously it's hindsight, but I could just imagine if they kept the aerodrome open at Kokoda, they got mortars in, they got other elements to support them, it may have been different. So really, between a whole Japanese task force, the advanced butai that landed, you have Templeton, and really, you take the PIB, I'm not sure in the exact numbers, but we're talking about 120 men, and the Japanese, within their element, they do land in the first 72 hours, I think, 1,500 to 2,000 troops. But of those troops, the ones that are going to go and push forward, not to take their objectives straight away, but to push forward from the main effort to make their way to Kokoda, You've got guys who have been training, they've been rehearsing in Rabaul. Most of the Japanese soldiers had already fought. Obviously, they fought the campaign to take Rabaul, but some of them had gone as early back as 1937 and fought in China. So these guys, 39th guys, you've got a couple of guys who have seen some service in the Middle East. For the most part, they've never been in the jungle and they've never seen any combat, including Templeton. So Templeton doesn't know what to do, really, if you can't get more troops in. And obviously lines of communication, radios don't work. They did have radios, but line aside, they weren't relied on, so what they had to use was runners. And the distance between Oivi and Kokoda is huge. It's a full day. You can get there, but for me, it would take me the best part of the day to walk. So if you're trying to send runners back and forth from Oivi to Kokoda, it's quite difficult. As I said, the CO, Galowan, got in with a few men. Templeton in total, including his Templeton, I think it was at Kokoda, has only about 120 men. And as I said, he's doing his best with the assets that he can. He digs in with 2 platoons at Oivi, and as I said, the Japanese have had a successful ambush against the Japanese. The Japanese keep coming forward and forward and forward, and Templeton decides that Oivi is the right place because it has high ground and it will make a defence, and he's living in hope that these guys coming from flying into Kokoda will come and give them reinforcements. As I said, only about 14 men came forward, and in the course of between 23 and 25 July, he holds that position. Towards the end, he's getting frustrated. They write notes on toilet paper. They send runners with toilet paper to try and, what's going on. And Templeton had already ran back to Kokoda, met the CO, and the CO had told him, Bill Owen had told him to get back there and hold the Japanese as best you can. Again, still with the hope of reinforcements arriving. What ends up happening is the Japanese start to circle around and get between the Australian positions at Oivi and the track, if you will, between Oivi and Kokoda. In fact, some of the Japanese rode bicycles, which had come, they had Rayleigh and British brands that they pinched on the way down, and there was a little road there, and one of the ambushes they had there actually shot Japanese soldiers up as they were pushing their gear along on bicycles. Templeton, as I said, is becoming, I believe, frustrated, agitated, because these reinforcements haven't arrived. They're trying to hold out for over 48 hours, and he sends a couple of runners. One of the runners he sent was a bloke named Sidney Moffat, who I'll get to in a moment. He disappears, no reinforcements come. He sends another man named Ted Stewart. Ted Stewart was very lucky because he's passed away now. He lived around the corner from him and had a great opportunity to interview him. And right at the last moment, which is very interesting from Templeton, I guess his mindset as a company commander, is he decided to stop Stewart and go himself. And if you think back to what I was saying, how he always thought he was missing out, now you think even when he got to Kokoda, he went to go and find but to link up with the stores coming back. Why does a company commander need to do that? And everyone that I interviewed that knew him, it was because that's Templeton's nature. He wanted to be up there, he wanted to be seeing what he just wanted to do the job himself. And also too, you think most of his charges were young kids basically. I mean, they were 20, but they're still young kids, and they affectionately called their commander Uncle Sam, because I guess this, he had a Northern Irish accent. He'd been in the militia for 10 years. I guess they had affection for him and they looked upon him for leadership. But his leadership can be questioned because, as I said, he was a bit of a micromanager and wanted to seem to be always doing tasks that he could have delegated. And unfortunately, it cost him his life. But what I argue in the book is because on that fateful day, 26 July, he stops Ted Stewart from going. He goes himself back down the track along to try and get back to Kokoda to see where these reinforcements are. The Japanese by this stage have started to come around the Australians and to encroach on the path that leads back to Kokoda. I mean, it's low-lying scrub, but it is undulating and it's not the mountains like the Allen Stanleys, but it's still harsh terrain. And when Ted Stewart came back, there was a 39th Battalion NCO called Matarama, and he says to the Sergeant Matarama says to Stewart, "Hey, where's the boss?" And he said, "Oh, he sent me back." And he said, "That's not right." So he takes off with one of the police local Papuan police guys, a guy named Sinopa, and the story goes that they go along the track and the local Papuan guide said, stop, stop, I can smell them, and before you know it, a shot rings out. And obviously the Japanese had now started to get all the way around to encircle the Australian positions at Oivi. That guy Sinopa I spoke about later leads all the men that are left there on an alternate track to get all the way up here, to Duniki, which is really the first high part on the Kokoda track itself. Like, this is high country overlooking Kokoda. So Templeton is, I believe, and that's what I argue in the book, he may have accidentally shot himself. There's talk that he may have shot himself with his own revolver in the leg. It may be that he got hit by a Japanese round, but nonetheless, according to primary source documents, like the Japanese medical doctor, he was definitely wounded by a gunshot wound in one of his legs. And the story goes is that he crawled under some local huts. He had the reports that he most likely was suffering malaria at this stage, because remember, these first guys that went out there had their sleeves rolled up, didn't have any malarial protection, wore shorts, and also he was obviously fatigued from being out there that long, and now he's got a gunshot wound. When the Japanese get to Oivi, the battle continues, even though the Australians, the ones that are obviously alive, have already gone on this alternate track up to Duniki, because in the Australian war diaries and the accounts of the soldiers, they talk about sitting up on the side of the mountain looking back down towards Oivi, still hearing a battle raging, even though they weren't there anymore. And nonetheless, Templeton was, though, and he got discovered by a Japanese medical doctor who, one, writes a report at the time, but he also writes a diary after the war. And if we get to, it was very scratchy and I typed it up for the book, so that's why it's written out the way it is. But this is an interpretation, or an interpreted Australian ATIS record at the AWM. This is what I found in relation to the intelligence report, several days after the battle at Oivi. And this is, their report: 5 enemy dead, 2 prisoners. I believe that the other prisoner is Sydney Moffat, the runner, most likely. Again, they've not found his body. And of course, most importantly, because he's an officer and named, is Captain Templeton. And so that makes him the first Australian officer to be captured in the Kokoda campaign. But that's all good and well, but what does it mean for the campaign in general? So the Japanese had a timeline to get all the way from the northern beaches, all the way across the Kokoda track and to Port Moresby. There's different reports. 2 weeks is one time frame that is thrown around. The Japanese went off with their mess tins with cooked rice and uncooked rice in the top section of it. They were to use the local vegetable gardens, etc. So the operation wasn't meant to be an operation for them that was going to turn out to be bogged down for several months in the Allen Stanley Ranges. Why I think Templeton's important, and this is what I argue in the book, is because several accounts, including official Japanese intelligence records, talks of Templeton lying not only about the numbers of Australians, and you think his rifle company is about 120, with the 14 extra men, 130 maybe, some PIB guys. Most of the PIB soldiers went back to their villages, which I don't blame them when the shots rang out. But you think about the actual force that was in Kokoda at the time, it wasn't many. It certainly wasn't 1,000. And Templeton, in the ATIS reports, said to the Japanese that there was 1,000 men, soldiers at Kokoda, and waiting back in Port Moresby, there was 20,000 soldiers. But other than 2 other militia battalions, and we had other, obviously, Angao, and we had other auxiliary things, we didn't have any main fighting force up there. The AIF, so the 21st Brigade that fights at Issarava and Brigade Hill, they don't arrive until the 14th of August. So what happens with this information? Well, Templeton is interrogated, of course. He's a high price, so much so back at that other slide, they named him, and he lies. And that information goes all the way back to Japanese 18th Army headquarters in Rabaul. The 18th Army commander tells Hori, who is the commander of the South Seas Force, who's tasked with this operation for the Japanese, he questioned him, do you actually believe it? And he says, it's not a matter of belief. He says something along the lines of, it's a matter of preparation and duty. And what they actually do, the main Japanese fighting arm was the 144th, but the 41st, they actually removed them from the Guadalcanal campaign. So if you think about it, Rabaul up the top, after Rabaul falls, the Japanese keep their base there for the duration of the war, but their coordinated attacks weren't just on Papua at the same time, that like the Battle of Isarava, August kicks off, and then Milne Bay, they're also fighting the Americans in Guadalcanal. So Templeton lying about the strength of the Australians, I argue, not only took resources from Guadalcanal, which some other historian could argue whether or not that made a contribution or had an effect or not, I don't know, but what it certainly did is it slowed and it hesitated the Japanese down. And if you know your Kokoda history, the first Battle of Kokoda happens on the 29th of July, and that's where Bill Owen is killed. But the Japanese, hesitate. My argument is that they hesitate based on this information. They get more resources and they delay their push over the Kokoda track. Now, if you keep that in perspective, the Battle of Isarava, where Bruce Kingsbury got the VC, as I said before, the 21st Brigade didn't arrive until 14th of August. This is happening in 26 to 30 July. There's plenty of high points on the Kokoda track, but the two main battles were Isarava and then Brigade Hill, and they were chosen because they were the high ground. So my argument is, had Templeton not lied, and the 39th and the PIB not did the best they could at the time, the Japanese might have got further along the Kokoda track. In fact, Kingsbury and Isarava may not have happened because the Japanese would have already passed that spot as they were heading towards Port Moresby. I've got this slide up here. You can see a map there, and it's got Templeton's Crossing. There it is up there. So some people that walk Kokoda track will look at modern day maps of the Kokoda track. There's Templeton's 1 and Templeton's 2. There's only one actual Templeton's Crossing. It's down near Eora Creek, and it's basically where one of the old mail routes used to cross Eora Creek. And the man in the photo who walked with Sam Templeton on his first journey with B Company when they set off from McDonald's Corner is, of course, his daughter-in-law Robin wrote the book Architect of Kokoda. He was a plantation owner down in the Yotta and the Eora Valleys at Kokoda. He was an Angao officer, but he was most famous for organising all the carriers, if you will. He didn't know Templeton before, obviously just couldn't know him after, but he only spent that week and a bit walking with Sam Templeton. Obviously they were the two senior men on the ground. And when he heard of Templeton missing, presumed killed, he named where he blazed a track across the Eora Creek at Templeton's Crossing. Because the first question that people ask, just when I guide treks over Kokoda, is this where Sam Templeton died? Well, it's not. It was just Bert Kingsell named it in his honour, and it's still quite a walk from Oivi. In my book, other than the HAS records, Japanese records from 18th Army in Rabaul, and the medical doctor's records, we have, I can't pronounce the Japanese name, but it starts with M, but an interpreter who also took notes because he was there when they interrogated most likely Sidney Moffat, but definitely Sam Templeton. You have this character who was a soldier, Nishimura. You may remember him as the bone man of Kokoda. He went back after the war and he mainly fought at Brigade Hill in the middle of the Kokoda track, and he went back after the war and dug up bones and went back to Japan and knocked on the door and said, here's the skull of your dead relative, all that sort of stuff. And he was a bit eccentric, you could say, within his own association, but in 2009 he claimed that he had been the one that buried Templeton's body down near Oivi. In fact, he drew a map where it was, and I wasn't involved in it, but an expedition was ran, but they didn't find, they found a watch cover, but that's probably just an Australian watch cover from the Battle of Oivi. But Nishimura was the last man standing, if you will, from the Japanese side, and he was taken back, you can see as an old man sitting in the chair there, he was taken back to the waterfall at Oivi. But as I said, they never found his body. But I do mention him in the book, but in the epilogue I also mentioned that it's not a trusted source. And again, this adds to the mystery and the mythology that surrounds Templeton. And importantly, to note that a lot of the Japanese associations and descendant groups, just like we have in Australia, made many visits. In fact, only 2 years ago I ran into one such group on the northern beaches at San Fernando. But they went back in the post-war years, and they would find Japanese remains. I mean, Nishimura took it to the extreme, but the associations ran different tours, just as the 39th and the 53rd and all those guys went back after the war to visit the battlefield. But it's most likely that Templeton's remains may have accidentally been cremated and taken back to the shrine in Tokyo, because that's what they would do when they'd cremate them on the spot, the Japanese, and take them back to Japan. Or he could be in Bamana, which I'll get to at the end. This newspaper clipping was The Sun. I think it's from the 60s. It's not dated. I tried to look at Trove when I was doing the research. But if you have a look at it, you can... Oh, you can't do that on the slide, but if you can have a look at it, it first appears, and it's underlined there, Q ships, submarines, French Foreign Legion. I think it also mentions the Moroccan clasp and rare metals and all this, but it was written to the Sun newspaper in Melbourne, most likely in the 60s, by an anonymous person. But I found out that that person was a 39th soldier named Jeff Burton. And Jeff Burton was just one of Sam Templeton's diggers, if you will. But when they first got to Port Moresby, before they went across the track, obviously Moresby from February onwards was starting to be bombed by the Japanese, and Burton and his mates had found a case of whiskey. And Templeton caught him, but he let him go, and he didn't charge him, he didn't say it. Jeff Burton always remembered that. And obviously the legend continues, and they called him Uncle Sam. And if you think about in the post-war years, I mean, Kokoda for me, certainly I went to school in the 90s, I didn't find out about it until the 2000s. And a lot of things like Tobruk, etc., was Greece, Crete, those sort of things kind of overshadowed what happened on our doorstep for a multitude of reasons, which I won't go into. But I think what was going on is Jeff Burton, who was involved with the Oakley RSL in Melbourne, he obviously had maybe a chip on the shoulder, but he certainly wanted to highlight their service in, they're not AIF, they were militia. They fought in the first part of the Kokoda campaign, and I think this is where some of the mythology started to surround it of Sam Templeton. So it's very easy with the distance of time for people to say, oh yeah, he's got an exotic accent, he's from Northern Ireland, oh, he might have been in the International Brigade. But as I said before, we've got primary source documents like his militia record that show that he was in the militia for all the time, for 10 years. You can't just duck off and fight overseas. This is Reg and me. I was very lucky to meet and get to know through the 39th Battalion Association Sam Templeton's son. The difference, I guess, because of the intergenerational thing, is that Reg, unlike, he's 97 now, but he was old enough to remember his father well, and had a relationship with his father when his father went off to war, never to come back again. And to this day, he's still affected by that. And in the course of me putting the book together, for example, I found photographs of his grandparents. He'd never seen a photograph of his grandparents from Ireland, which I managed to get off Ancestry, and connect to relatives of theirs in Canada. So I mean, that in itself was worth it. But he gave me several hours of recorded interviews of all those family stories. Some obviously with the passage of time may have been embellished, but there's some great stories which I have in the book, and one quick story which I'll end on that Reg talks about is that it's actually changed if you go to Melbourne now, because they're building Anzac, which is this underground station near the shrine. But for a long time, across from the Domain Interchange, there was an obelisk, which was a Boer War. It wasn't actually on the shrine grounds, but around there was public toilets, and there was benches that you could sit on. And when Sam and his brother were down there, because Sam didn't drink, he wasn't a drinker, but they'd go down there with his courting Doris, who would end up being his wife, and his brother was there, and according to Reg, there's an altercation in the toilets, and Sam and his brother run in there, but there's a man who's beating another man, and he's got a shiny silver gun, and apparently that man was Squizzy Taylor. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. It's in the book, but great stories nonetheless before Templeton's march into history. So I'm going to leave it there, ladies and gentlemen. Look, I didn't give it all away, because obviously I encourage people to read the book, but I guess what I will end on is that, the story, the service and sacrifice of a guy that started his life in Northern Ireland, came all the way to Australia, lost a kid in infancy, and ended up history having put him at the first battle of, or the first opening stages of the Kokoda campaign, and for him to lie and to slow the Japanese down, I think he was certainly worthy of a book, but him and his men are certainly worthy of remembrance. So thanks, ladies and gentlemen.
We've got some time for any questions, so I'll open up. Yes.
David, as a 2-year-old, I was evacuated from Port Moresby on the 18th of December 1941 in the SS Katoomba. And my father was the RSM of the standing Port Moresby garrison. These were regular soldiers. And I understand he had to remain as we went south for safety, but they morphed into New Guinea Force. I have a photograph of him in his ceremonial uniform with a shoulder of New Guinea Force. What was New Guinea Force?
So New Guinea Force, so you're right, there were people who were living in, not to overcomplicate the answer, but Papua, which was sovereign territory of Australia, as opposed to mandated territory of New Guinea, when martial law was declared, and yes, women and children, European women and children were encouraged to, they were asked to leave. But New Guinea Force incorporated militia soldiers from mainland Australia, some specialists, some artillery, anti-aircraft in the end, but also there were plenty of members who were, Territorians, if you will, people that were living there. And as my understanding is, they weren't, at the time that the war, that things were heating up, they did start to do full-time service, but they were their own reserve force, if you will, in the territory, made up of people who lived there who did service. And the same in the mandated territory, we had the New Guinea Volunteer Rifles. But all of those elements came under New Guinea Force, including the militia soldiers that were sent up from mainland Australia. So I suspect, I suspect that your father was one of those men. And if he'd been living in the territory in Papua, that's what they did. They got called up for full-time service. Because it's very important to note that time at the start of the war in the Pacific, most of our AF guys, they were over in the Middle East. We'd sent some of the 8th Division out, Ambon and Timor and Eastern Britain, which is Gull, Sparrow and Lark Force, for this buffer zone. But they could get away with Papua down the bottom by using, men that didn't have X in their numbers because it was sovereign territory as opposed to mandated territory or territory even outside of our territory. Yeah.
Do you know why they stopped delivering troops to Kokoda by air?
Yeah. So at the initial stages, the aerodrome, there was actually 2 airstrips in the vicinity. One was at Kokoda itself, just down from the plateau, which is still there today. The other one was not too far away on the other side of the Manbear River, which was an airstrip that the Kounzel family had put in, and other people, expats or whatever you want to call them, living in the territory, and they got a lot of gold dredging equipment and stuff like that, produce flying in and out. That one was not utilised by either side. Funny enough, the Japanese never exploited the Kokoda airstrip. The Australians were relying on US Army, Air Force guys to fly them in, and when this happened, there's a couple of things going on. There's the gap, the Kokoda gap. So even the planes, like the bombers and that from Port Moresby, were going off to bomb the Japanese, either, in particular Salmau and Lae. They had a window where they could get over the gap and then get back. At the time that this was kicking off, the Australians, the 39th guys, and I think it was 10 platoon, Judy Garland, Arthur Judy Garland was the platoon commander, they had put obstacles across the airstrip to deny the Japanese from landing, and then when they knew one of theirs was landing, they would move them off. And all of Don Company, the Bruce McLean that I spoke about, he's one of those 14 men that come in, they had them all lined up. All the 39th guys were lined up at Jackson's Airfield down in Port Moresby, ready to fly in. They'd done one chalk where they brought the CO in and a few other men. They did a second one where they could only take 14 of the D Company guys. The other half gets on another plane, because about 40 minutes flying time out there, and they fly over, and there's a great little story where one of the American crew on the plane said, "What are you doing to our kite?" Because the guy, they had no armaments on those planes, and they smashed the window and pointed the Bren gun out, because some of the 39th, that's another point of difference, they actually got issued with some, they had Lewis guns, the B Company, but they also had some Bren guns, but they were few in number. But they did that, they circled the aerodrome, and the guys on the ground had cleared it and was waving to it, but the American pilots were worried about Japanese Zeros, and they left, and then they refused to do any more sorties at that time. And unfortunately, after Doug McLean's guys get in, because that flight where he puts the Bren gun and they're trying to land and he doesn't land, they turn around, they go back to Port Moresby. Those guys the rest of the Dom Company have to walk across the Kokoda track from Port Moresby. But yeah, in hindsight, had they been able to land, because forward of Kokoda and Oivy and those other areas, we still owned that area, and had they landed, even the rest of the 39th, and in particular, the 39th did have 3-inch mortars and 2-inch mortars. Had they landed the mortars down on the airfield and got most of the battalion in, there would have certainly been a different stand, and perhaps the CO wouldn't have been killed at the first battle of Kokoda. So, but to answer your story, yeah, at the end of the day, the American pilots thought that it was too hot. They were worried about Japanese Zeros, no armaments, no fighter escorts, and they turned around. Yeah. Exactly.
Any other questions?
I can have them all there as well.
One more? Yep.
You mentioned Jock Wilkinson's diary. Do you have that diary?
I don't have the actual diary, but there is a book which has been printed 3 times called Mud Over Blood, Stories of the 39th, by an author, Melbourne author named Carl Johnson, who had helped me with the research. In fact, Carl was very... he got the Sam Templeton, Sydney Moffat, Reg T, all those guys that were captured and most likely killed by the Japanese onto the National POW Memorial at Ballarat. So his research, I built upon some of those things, but in his publication, he has published verbatim the diary that pertaining to that march across the Kokoda track. John Wilson, funny enough, didn't have much faith in B Company. He didn't think they were anything. They weren't much chop, because he'd seen other service himself. I think he'd been a veteran of the Middle East campaign. He was attached to them as their medic, if you will. And but he kept a diary. It's published in Carl's book, and that was the diary that we followed for that section. That's 8-9 days section when we tried to walk the Kokoda track over. But if you have a look at Carl's book, he's written the whole thing out pertaining to that part of the campaign. Yeah.
Well, can I ask you again to put your hands together and thank David? I'll ask